What happens when the person you just humiliated turns out to be the one who holds your fate in their hands? Savannah, Georgia. What began as a seemingly ordinary morning at the federal courthouse quickly turned into the scene of an unthinkable humiliation. A black woman walked in, only to be pulled out of line, interrogated, and forcibly shaved, right inside the very place where justice is meant to prevail. But there was one thing those officers didn't know. The woman wasn't a defendant nor a witness. She was the judge. And just minutes later, she would take her seat on the bench, holding full authority in her hands. From a racially charged head shaving to a verdict that shook the nation, and the birth of a judicial reform bill called the Horizon Act, Janelle Brooks' story didn't just leave America stunned. It forced the entire system to take a long, hard look in the mirror. Follow the entire journey, told in real time, from one fateful morning to the moment one woman stood up and made the country listen. And if you believe true justice begins when we dare to speak the truth, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs a reason to keep believing. That morning in Savannah, the sky was still hazy, and the sunlight had only just begun to brush the dome of the Savannah District Courthouse. A seemingly ordinary morning, like hundreds of others. But history has a way of choosing the most unassuming moments to begin what no one could foresee. Janelle Brooks parked her silver Buick Encore by the curb, not far from the courthouse's old stone steps. She stepped out, closed the car door with a firm, deliberate motion, neither rushed nor aggressive, as if everything was under control. In her hand was a black leather case, simple, neat, not holding evidence or legal documents, but something far heavier. Justice, waiting to be handled the right way. She wore a navy blue suit, sleeves buttoned at the wrists, thin gold-rimmed glasses that caught the morning sun. Nothing flashy, nothing that said who she was, and that was intentional. Janelle had never entered a courthouse in a judge's robe. To her, justice didn't need ceremony to walk beside it. She preferred to observe quietly before making decisions, to take in the air, the eyes of people passing, the echo of footsteps along hallways steeped in history. But that morning, no one was observing her. No one recognized her. And then the unthinkable happened, right where she believed she would be safest. The main security door opened with its usual metallic hiss. A breeze swept through the stone hallway, carrying the scent of old wood from the reception desk. Behind the security scanner stood Deputy Marshal Briggs, a stocky man with thick wrists, close-cropped silver hair, dark eyes and eyebrows that perpetually angled downward in suspicion of all things. Briggs was the kind of man people referred to as old school but effective, a relic of order few dared to challenge. But that morning it took only one glance for him to fail to see a citizen, let alone a judge. All he saw was a black woman walking into a courthouse. And for Briggs, that alone was reason enough to raise suspicion. "Ma'am, step aside," Briggs said, his arm already blocking her path. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried command. Janelle paused, calm but not timid. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked. Briggs scanned her from head to toe, his gaze tracing every crease of her suit, every curve of her silver hair neatly twisted into a bun. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he muttered something not meant for anyone in particular. People walking in here like they own the place. No name tag, no badge, no robe. To him, she was nobody. Janelle slowly pulled out her credentials and held them forward. Sunlight caught the polished metal. Federal Judge, United States District Court. Briggs didn't bother to look closely. He took the ID between two fingers, flipped it over like a magazine coupon, and tucked it into his shirt pocket as if it were something borrowed from a stranger. She looked at him, her voice calm but firm. "I need my badge returned." Briggs raised an eyebrow and nodded toward the hallway to the left. "She's in a rush, huh? Come with me. Random screening." "Random screening?" she repeated, a crease forming for the first time between her brows. Briggs didn't wait for a reply. His hand landed on her arm, guiding her toward a private screening room, a windowless space tucked behind the main security scanners, a place no one entered unless there was a reason. At that moment, Janelle noticed the eyes of a younger staff member, a female security officer standing near the scanning machine. Her gaze wavered, as if she wanted to intervene, but swallowed the words instead. Her name wouldn't appear until later, but that image, someone witnessing injustice and unable to speak, had already begun shaping something far larger. The door slammed shut behind them. Inside, a metal chair, a small cart with scanning equipment, and, most chilling of all, a pair of electric clippers resting silently on a metal tray. No warrant, no lawyer, no justification. "I do not consent to this," Janelle said, her voice turning sharp. "You have no authority to detain me. Your actions are in violation of federal law." Briggs only smirked. "You're acting nervous. That's cause enough." She didn't move, but two others entered, a young officer and another man avoiding eye contact, flanking her like they were preparing to do something they knew was wrong. "Standard protocol," Briggs said, picking up the clippers. "You could be hiding something in that mop." His other hand gripped her shoulder. The clippers buzzed to life. Vrrr, like a swarm of angry bees echoing through the small room. The first silver lock of hair fell to the floor, severing a strand of her past. Then the second, then the third. The cold from the clippers sliced through her scalp like a silent blade, stripping away dignity with every stroke. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not a single tear fell. Only her hands clenched tightly on her lap, knuckles pale from the pressure, and her eyes not pleading, but warning. "You just messed with the wrong person?" One of the men behind her murmured, "She looks better like that." Briggs brushed hair off his sleeve like he'd just completed a necessary task. "Now you look more presentable." She stood without waiting for permission, walked out of the room without a word, retrieved her credentials from Briggs's desk in silence. His gaze followed her, part smugness, part cruel satisfaction, like a man who thought he'd just taught an uppity girl a lesson. But he didn't know the real lesson was about to be his. In the hallway, no one said a word. Two clerks passed her, glanced, then looked away. People who had seen, maybe people who had known, but none spoke, and Janelle didn't need them. She didn't need them to see her as a victim. She didn't walk like someone shamed. She walked like someone about to dismantle an entire system from the inside, step by step, with the law, with the truth, and with something they thought she'd lost: dignity. Because what Deputy Marshal Briggs never imagined was that the woman he'd just humiliated hadn't come to attend a hearing, not to observe, not to stand trial. She had come to preside over court, and justice was about to show its real face. Janelle walked down the long hallway, the light from old frosted windows casting a cold golden glow across the polished stone floor. Her footsteps echoed evenly, not fast, not slow, but with an unusual weight. No one blocked her path. No one dared ask where she was going. Though her face remained stoic, her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the fury clenched in every fiber of her being. With each step, her scalp throbbed, not from physical pain, but from the loss of each silver strand, each thread of memory, each piece of history that had just been stripped from her body without mercy. She knew she couldn't reclaim what had been taken, but she also knew the ones who had taken it had no idea what they just lost. At the door to courtroom 3, where a high-profile federal case on police violence during last year's protests was set to begin, the atmosphere froze. People chatted, shuffled documents, lawyers arranged papers, and media crews adjusted cameras at the back of the room. But when the double doors opened, a different air swept in. No one in the room knew why it suddenly went silent. They just knew the bareheaded woman walking in, with unwavering eyes, didn't resemble anyone they had ever seen before. Janelle said nothing. She walked past the gallery, past the rows of attorneys, past the reporters, and made her way directly to the judge's bench, the leather chair behind a carved oak panel bearing the symbol of justice. People glanced at one another, waiting for someone to stop her, but no one moved. And then, like an invisible tremor rippling through the room, realization hit. The woman who had just been escorted from a security room like a suspicious outsider was the one presiding over this trial. Deputy Marshal Briggs stood near the side door of the courtroom, leaning casually against the wall like he had for countless hearings. But this time, when Janelle's eyes met his, he froze. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. His face tightened, throat dry, and if one looked closely, the vein at his temple had begun to twitch. He was no longer in control, and the most terrifying part was that he knew it. Janelle stepped up to the bench. No escort, no introduction, no ceremony needed. She picked up her judge's robe, neatly folded on the chair, and draped it over her shoulders. A slow movement, unhurried, as if closing one chapter and opening a new era. As the robe settled, it was no longer a symbol of office. It became armor. Armor of truth, experience, and courage. She turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" Her voice was steady, low, unwavering. The clerk, a woman in her 40s, replied, her voice trembling, "Yes, Your Honor. It's ready." Janelle gave a slight nod and sat down. The leather creaked beneath her, and in that moment of silence it sounded like thunder. All eyes were on her, some confused, some shocked, others furious. Furious that this black woman, the one they assumed had been humiliated and stripped of power, now sat there, calm, firm, and completely unbroken. Without looking at Briggs, without mentioning what had happened outside, Janelle picked up the gavel and struck it once. Bang! The sound echoed through the chamber like a sacred beginning. We will begin with preliminary statements for case number 2371F. United States v. Savannah Police Department, allegations of abuse of power, excessive use of force, and violation of civil rights. Her voice was not loud, but it rang with authority. The room responded in unison. "Yes, Your Honor." But behind the words was a stunned disbelief that had yet to settle. Janelle didn't care. She hadn't come to be accepted. The first witness to take the stand was Lieutenant Darren Cole, the officer in charge of the rapid response team during the protest. He wore a crisp uniform and walked with steady steps, but his eyes darted away. In his report, Cole claimed the incident had been handled according to riot protocol, but the victim, a 74-year-old veteran, had been shoved to the ground and suffered 2 broken ribs while raising his hands in peace. Janelle asked no questions during his initial testimony. She only watched. She watched Cole as if peeling back the layers of a system fluent in administrative deception. As the second witness prepared to take the stand, Janelle abruptly called for a 15-minute recess. The courtroom rustled as people rose and began to exit. No one spoke loudly. No one asked questions. The air was thick, compressed with tension. But Janelle did not leave her seat. She remained still, cold, waiting. Only she, 2 court staffers, and 1 other remained. Briggs, who stood frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay. As he turned to exit, Janelle's voice rang out, sharp as a blade. "Deputy Briggs." He flinched, jolted as if struck by electricity. "Step forward." Her voice wasn't raised, but each word hit like a drumbeat. Briggs stepped forward, like a man walking a cliff's edge. "Your full name?" "Marshall Briggs." "How long have you worked in this courthouse?" 14 years. His voice was thin, barely a whisper. Janelle tapped her pen against her notebook. Once, twice. "In those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in the secondary screening room?" Briggs opened his mouth. I didn't. I'm not asking if you know who I am. I'm asking, how many?" No response. She continued. "There are 12 formal complaints. 12. All dismissed." Briggs swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "Exactly," she cut in. "That's the problem. You didn't want to know. Because to you, I was just a black woman walking into a building you thought you owned." The room was silent as a tomb. No camera clicks, no coughs, only the sound of justice rising from the very person they had tried to bury. Janelle stood. "Because of you, this temple of justice has been defiled. Because of your actions, trust in the law has been shaken. And because you assaulted a federal judge inside this courthouse, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation." She turned to the 2 officers near the door. "Place him under arrest. Keep him separate from General Holding. Charges will follow." Briggs opened his mouth to protest, but it was too late. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The man who once believed he held all the power. Now escorted out, no one spoke in his defense. As the doors closed behind him, no one in the courtroom dared to move. And Janelle knew. The fight had just begun. But this time, She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. And this time, silence would no longer be an option. Immediately after Deputy Marshal Briggs was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom remained engulfed in a kind of atmosphere that defied easy description. Not fear, not quite shock, but a deep internal tremor, as if a structure of power long believed to be unshakable had just cracked before everyone's eyes. Janelle Brooks sat back in the judge's chair, her hands resting on the oak bench, her gaze steady. She had always known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so quickly, and she certainly didn't expect to feel so calm as she stared down a system unraveling from within. The court clerk approached and whispered something in her ear. Janelle nodded slowly, then turned forward and tapped the gavel lightly. Before we proceed with the next witness, this court will allow a special statement. Anyone present who has ever filed a formal or informal complaint against Deputy Briggs is permitted to speak. Justice should not require an invitation to be heard. The room fell into a silence so complete that the faint draft slipping through the window behind her could be heard. Then from the third row, a salt and pepper-haired man in a wrinkled shirt stood up. His voice trembled, but it was resolute. "My name is Louis Bryant. Briggs broke 2 of my ribs right in the main lobby of this courthouse in 2011. I was protesting what I believed was the wrongful conviction of my daughter. He said I was causing a disturbance, slammed me against the wall. No warning, no explanation. I filed a complaint right there at that reception desk, and they told me I had tripped. That's what they wrote in the report." Janelle said nothing, but her eyes softened, as if seeing a part of herself in that old man, a part that had once been made to believe that truth was something others could rewrite on paper. "Thank you, Mr. Bryant. You stood up, and today, that means something." As she finished speaking, another hand was raised, then another. Quickly, the courtroom seemed to tremble under the weight of people rising. 5, 10, 15, each with a story. Each story a wound, not just to the body, but to the soul. A woman in the back row held up a crumpled piece of paper, its ink faded and smeared with water. It was a photocopy of a 2009 complaint form, one that was never assigned a case number. Another person held up a photo ID of her daughter, who had once been detained without cause for refusing to open her purse, under Briggs's order. A young man with tangled hair whispered, "All I ever wanted was to get my voice back, but after he slammed my head down, I haven't been able to sing since." The room was no longer just a courtroom. It had become a confessional, not for the defendant, but for a system that had buried its wrongs under the cold language of protocol, standard procedure, and insufficient evidence. Janelle watched them all, interrupting no one. She let them speak, because she understood deeply. There are pains that, if never spoken, will consume a person's entire life. Finally, when everyone had returned to their seats, Janelle calmly but firmly announced an emergency call for an internal witness. A name echoed through the chamber that made heads turn. Tamara Ellis. A middle-aged woman in a muted brown suit stepped forward, her bronze-rimmed glasses giving her face an added severity. "Ms. Tamara Ellis, how long did you serve as this court's record archivist?" 8 years officially, 4 more before that in intake. "During that time, did you handle internal complaints related to Deputy Briggs?" Tamara took a deep breath, then nodded. "More than I can remember. At least 12 formal cases, around 20 informal ones. Some were submitted and then returned. Some disappeared. Some were marked as resolved before I even opened them." The room held its breath. "Who gave those orders?" Janelle asked. Tamara hesitated but then answered, without looking away even once. "Judge Alan Merritt." A murmur rippled across the room like distant thunder. Everyone knew that name, a former chief judge, celebrated for his contributions to state law, and the man who had once mentored Janelle into the federal system. Janelle's face didn't flinch, but in her eyes something shifted, deeper, farther away, as though something she had once used as a pillar of belief had just collapsed. "Why?" she asked. Tamara replied slowly, "He said, if too many incidents were made public, the public's trust would falter. The court had to preserve its image. Sometimes, the truth needed to be kept quiet." Janelle sat up straight. "Thank you, Miss Ellis. Today you did not choose quiet. Today you chose justice. She tapped the gavel again, her voice rising with calm strength in a courtroom that was no longer simply a place of law, but a place where history was rewriting itself. Court is in recess. When we return, we will not only hear more witnesses, we will examine every document this system once tried to bury. And this time, no file will go missing. No voice will be forgotten. And no one, not even the man who once mentored me, will be allowed to stand outside the light. As she stepped down from the bench, the eyes of the reporters, the attorneys, and even those who once kept their distance had changed. They no longer looked at her merely as a judge. They looked at her as someone who had ignited a reckoning unlike anything the state's judicial history had ever seen. When court resumed after the recess, the air in the courtroom had changed, not because more people had arrived, but because of the way they sat, the way they looked at Janelle Brooks, as if she had just torn open a door that had been locked far too long. And she knew, when that door opened, what poured in wasn't just air. It was truth. It was pain. It was the forgotten history of those who had never been heard. On the witness stand, a middle-aged man was called, Howard Briggs, no relation to Deputy Marshal Briggs, but sharing the same surname like a bitter irony. He was a warehouse worker, his beard flecked with silver, his hands rough, his eyes void of surprise. He hadn't come to impress. He had come to speak of the night his 17-year-old son was pinned to the pavement during a peaceful protest. An officer had driven a knee into the boy's neck, and since then, he had never spoken above a whisper. Howard recounted it in detail, every minute soaked in pain, every desperate call for help, every indifferent glance from officers. We begged them to call an ambulance. They said, he's faking it. But I'm his father. I know when my son's faking, and he wasn't. Now every morning I have to drive him to school, wait while he types into a speech app to talk to his teacher. And still, the police report says he suffered minor abrasions. That's the version of the truth they wrote. No one spoke. A few in the gallery lowered their heads. A woman in the fourth row clutched her daughter's hand. A man removed his glasses and wiped his eyes without needing a tissue. Janelle nodded. Thank you, Mr. Briggs. What you've shared today has been recorded and heard the right way. As Howard stepped down from the witness stand, he passed by the three officers seated at the defendant's table, the ones present at the scene that night. One turned away. The other two looked up but didn't meet his eyes. None of them apologized. Outside, a crowd had begun to form. Wooden signs, handwritten posters, and bold slogans began appearing on the courthouse's stone steps. From 3 people to 7, then more than 20. They didn't shout. They stood, silent. But that silence roared louder than 100 chants. A reporter from Atlanta began live streaming. A mother from Charleston held up a photo of her son, once detained in this very courthouse for 9 hours for forgetting his ID. A veteran from Jacksonville, still in uniform, held a sign high. Protect Black women. Protect our judges. Inside, Janelle made an unprecedented announcement, a 30-minute adjournment to allow the court to review additional evidence submitted by the public. If you have records, witness accounts, or documents previously denied, bring them in. Today, every voice has a place. The clerk looked at her, visibly moved. No judge had ever opened the courtroom like this before, and Janelle knew, precisely because no one ever had, it was time to begin. Then someone entered with a large folder, a woman in a cardigan, reading glasses, graying hair. Her name was Vivian Reed, formerly of the courthouse's public intake department. She submitted a nearly 3-inch thick file, handwritten letters, photocopies of complaints, and even recordings from internal calls. I no longer work here, she said softly, but I kept a copy. I thought I should have deleted it, but I couldn't. Janelle said nothing. She only nodded. A single nod, part judge, part fellow survivor. Before breaking for recess, Janelle summoned the court's tech team and gave a directive. Publicly play all archived surveillance footage from the courthouse's secondary screening room. The room where Briggs had operated. No edits, no cuts. One clip showed a middle-aged Black woman forced into a chair without explanation. Another, grainier video showed Briggs himself reaching for the clippers. No narration, no subtitles. The images alone were enough to silence the room. Out in the hallway, longtime employees began to murmur. Some started pulling out their phones. Others quietly exited through side doors. Janelle knew what they feared wasn't the footage. It was being seen after staying silent for too long. And this time, that silence was going on trial too. As the afternoon session was nearing adjournment, someone entered the courtroom. Not a witness, not a reporter. Reverend Curtis Dean, once a leader of civil rights marches 2 decades ago. His hair was snow white, but his voice still carried steel. He didn't take the stand, didn't request to speak. He simply walked to the front row and placed a stack of papers on the clerk's desk. A list of names. Victims who had never been heard, never been called, never made it into the official records. Janelle picked it up, scanning through. The paper trembled slightly in her hand. Each name was a wound. Each note, a sentence that had never been read aloud. And she knew. This was no longer a trial. This was a cleansing, a storm, an earthquake shaking the foundations they once thought were eternal. Outside the courthouse, people still stood, hand in hand, heads held high. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew one thing. History had begun to move, and Janelle Brooks was no longer just a name on the federal bench. She had become the face of a justice reckoning like no other. The next morning, Savannah was blanketed in a quiet, persistent rain, as if even the clouds were weighed down by something unspeakable. It wasn't a storm, but a slow, deliberate cleansing, washing over the courthouse's gray stone steps like a ritual of reckoning. Inside her chambers, Janelle Brooks sat at her heavy walnut desk, holding a folder marked Confidential. No one knocked when the file was delivered. An elderly administrative staffer, who had served under 3 chief judges, simply placed it on her desk, nodded once, and walked away as if the document he'd just touched was on fire. Janelle opened the folder with both hands, carefully, as if unlocking a door to a memory she once believed was solid. Inside was a collection of cold language, transcripts, letters, internal memos, documents marked urgent, and most notably, 12 official complaints against Deputy Briggs over 15 years. Every single one stamped, insufficient evidence, unsubstantiated, resolved internally. But what stopped her cold wasn't the content. It was the name at the bottom of each rejection. Alan Merritt, former chief judge of the district, the very man who had mentored her since day one in the federal judicial system. The man who once said at her appointment ceremony, "You are the future the judiciary needs." Something inside Janelle cracked, but did not collapse. Like a pillar snapped in half yet still standing, because its roots clung deep to the earth. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just read. Every word, every page, every line crafted to defend a system built on institutional silence. And then, at the end of the file, a handwritten memo appeared, dated 5 years ago, from Alan Merritt to the head of court security. One line read, "Briggs may be rough, but he keeps order, especially with certain groups. Best to let him be." Janelle clenched the page, her knuckles going pale, then released it. Her eyes didn't well with cinematic tears. They didn't sting like poetic metaphors. They burned, like iron pulled from fire, a heat only justice could awaken. A few hours later, the courtroom was packed. The press had descended on Savannah. National outlets, CNN, MSNBC, even the BBC, had dispatched reporters. A row of black law students from Howard University filled the front seats. No one came just to witness a trial. They came to witness a turning point. When Janelle entered, no one needed to say, "All rise." They rose, all of them. Not for her title, but for the truth she now embodied. She struck the gavel. Before we proceed with cross-examination, let it be entered into the record. A new set of documents has been submitted this morning, containing all complaints filed against Deputy Briggs, internal communications regarding concealment, and the names of every individual who signed off on their dismissal. The defense attorney began to rise in protest, but Janelle raised her hand. "Sit down." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like steel. She turned to the gallery. "Let it also be entered into the record. This court is no longer interested in protecting the structure. This court will no longer pretend that silence is neutral. Every signature in this file was a choice, not a mistake. And that choice was to ignore victims, to shield the violator, to preserve the illusion of order built on fear. A sound stirred at the back of the room. A man stood, his hand trembling as he held a soft cap. "Your Honor," he said, voice catching, "my name is Louis Bryant. I know I spoke yesterday, but there's something I didn't say. After I filed that complaint against Briggs in 2011, I was called into a judge's office. Not for help, but to be persuaded to stay silent. The man who spoke to me was none other than Judge Merritt. He said, 'We'll handle it internally, but if you make noise, your daughter will have no future here.' I stayed quiet for 12 years because of that sentence, until today." No one breathed. Janelle stood, not in protest, but to meet his gaze and to let the room witness what had long sustained this system, the silence of good people. She said nothing, but Bryant nodded, a nod that meant, "Today we've said enough." Following that day's session, 3 retired judges and a former district attorney simultaneously announced they were withdrawing from all public duties due to health reasons. But everyone knew this wasn't a cardiac condition. It was a fear of exposure. And Janelle knew the real battle was only beginning. On Tuesday morning, the skies were clear, but hearts were heavy. The courtroom windows hadn't even opened before the square outside the Hall of Justice echoed with footsteps. People gathered, more by the minute, with no organizer, no rallying cry. They came by instinct, the instinct of those who knew that if they didn't stand up today, tomorrow it could be their child, their friend, their community who would be the next victim. On the stone steps where only legal personnel usually passed, there were now wooden signs bearing scrawled messages. "Justice isn't optional. 12 complaints, 0 accountability. Brooks for truth." Inside the courtroom, Janelle Brooks entered not through the judge's private entrance, but through the same door as everyone else. She wanted to walk among the people, to hear their voices, see their faces, and feel the charged atmosphere, dense with both hope and anger. As she approached the bench, the entire room stood up instinctively. No one questioned who she was anymore. There were no more doubtful looks, only expectation and resolve. Right from the start, Janelle declared, "Before we proceed, I would like to read into the record an urgent initiative from this court, effective immediately." She opened a slim folder, gray cover stamped with the title, "The Horizon Act." Her voice was low but carried clearly. "I am introducing and enacting an internal reform mandate, formally named the Brooks Mandate, a measure to monitor and prevent racial bias, abuse of authority, and ethical misconduct among law enforcement personnel in the federal courts." The courtroom began to murmur. She raised her hand for silence. "This mandate includes, first, all court officers, bailiffs, and federal courthouse security staff in Savannah District are required to undergo mandatory training on racial bias, behavior regulation, and ethical conduct, monitored by an independent oversight body. Second, all personnel must undergo regular psychological evaluations with immediate dismissal upon identification of violent or deviant tendencies. Third, any individual who has been the subject of 3 or more complaints, even without formal disciplinary outcomes, shall be placed on temporary suspension and subject to reevaluation. Fourth, the practice of erasing complaints or labeling them handled internally shall no longer be valid. All such records must be uploaded to the federal database and made transparently available to the media. At the defendant's table, one attorney stood up. "Your Honor, do you have the authority to implement a policy of this scope?" Janelle didn't hesitate. When a system refuses to act, the moral duty falls on the one holding the gavel to begin. If this mandate must be brought before Congress, I am prepared to take it there. But I will not wait on them to start fixing what's broken. Because people like me, people who were shaved bald right here, do not have the luxury of waiting another generation to be treated with dignity." The law students in the front row lit up like dry grass catching fire. One of them, a brown-skinned young woman with curly hair, pulled out her phone and began live streaming. Her caption read, "This isn't just a courtroom. It's the start of something bigger." That afternoon, the trial continued with a special witness brought in from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was a former internal systems technician at the Savannah Courthouse who had resigned 2 years earlier. He confirmed that between 2012 and 2020, at least 7 complaint records had disappeared from the internal digital database, under informal instructions from upper management. "We didn't delete them," he said. "We were told to temporarily hide them for later review." But that later never came. When the session ended, Janelle remained in the courtroom alone. Outside, heavy rain tapped against the window panes. A young staffer passed by and glanced in. He gave her a quick thumbs up, his expression slightly awkward, then hurried away, as if afraid someone might see. She didn't smile. She didn't shake her head. She understood that real change doesn't come from the sound of a gavel, but from moments like that, when someone, even hesitantly, begins to take a stand for what's right. And if you felt a spark in moments like these, if this story stirred something inside you, if it challenged your beliefs about justice and human dignity, let us know. Click like if you support the Horizon Act. Hit subscribe to follow more stories that are real, weighty, and worthy. And if you've ever witnessed injustice but couldn't speak up, leave a comment below. Because maybe today is the day you're finally heard and finally believed. When Briggs was brought back into the courtroom, his footsteps sounded like the collapse of an entire past behind him. The uniform was gone, replaced by a wrinkled gray shirt and the faint glint of handcuffs under his sleeve. He didn't raise his head, didn't look at anyone. The 2 officers escorting him didn't need to hold him tight. He already knew there was nowhere left to run. The courtroom was still. No coughing, no shifting in seats. No one had come to watch a man punished. They came to witness justice. Justice that, for the first time, wasn't on the side of the badge. Janelle Brooks sat upright, her eyes steady. When he stood before the bench, she didn't greet him, didn't lead him in. She read, slowly, precisely, like she was naming every offense the system once dismissed as minor. Marshall Briggs, based on the established evidence, witness testimonies, and internal records revealed during this proceeding, the Federal District Court of Savannah finds you guilty. 6 years imprisonment for abuse of power under color of law. 5 years for violating civil rights protected by the Constitution. 1 additional year for obstruction of a federal investigation and destruction of evidence. Briggs shook his head slightly, still silent. But as the 2 officers moved toward him, Janelle raised her hand to stop them. She stood. Not as a judge, but as the first victim bold enough to deliver a moral sentence. "That was the legal part," she said, her voice calm. "Now comes the human part. I don't speak for revenge. I don't speak to make you regret. I speak so that everyone watching understands one thing. Power without dignity is just a license to harm others." She stepped down from the bench, approaching Briggs face to face. "You used handcuffs, clippers, and the silence of the system to decide who was worthy of respect. You believed the badge was your shield, but you forgot that the law was never in your pocket. It was in every action you chose not to take." Briggs finally looked up, his eyes hollow, lips trembling, not out of fear, but because for the first time in his life, he was being forced to listen to a voice he once dismissed as anonymous. Janelle nodded. "Now you will sit in the very chair you once forced others into. No robe, no authority, just a name, and everything that comes with it." She turned to the officers. "Take him away." The steel door at the back of the courtroom opened. No applause, no cheers, just eyes watching a chapter end in silence. But not a silence of complicity. This time, a silence of reckoning. That afternoon, a special press conference was held inside the courtroom, with Janelle standing at the center, not to preside, but to announce what came next. "As of today," she said, "the Savannah Federal District Court has formally submitted the full text of the Horizon Act, a judiciary reform initiative aimed at restoring public trust, protecting true justice, and eliminating the gray zones where power once hid." A reporter asked, "Do you believe this act will pass at the federal level?" She replied firmly, "If not, we'll bring it to other courts. If we have to every state. But I will not wait for another incident, another victim, or another shaved head before we act." Another reporter followed up. "What about those who once stood with Briggs, who signed off on dismissed complaints? Will they be held accountable?" She didn't hesitate. Justice doesn't pick sides. And the Horizon Act doesn't offer exemptions. If you signed out of fear, I invite you to step forward. If out of agreement, I invite you to step out of this system entirely. The conference ended in quiet. No chants, no slogans. But outside the courthouse, hundreds still stood. An elderly woman embraced her granddaughter. A young man held up a handwritten sign. This time, the gavel didn't fall on us. Not everyone understood the full scope of the trial, but everyone felt one thing. Something had changed, not just because Briggs was arrested, but because, for the first time, someone inside the system had the courage to break it, from the inside out. That evening, Savannah remained damp after the rain, but the sky began to open, and the setting sun filtered softly through the glass panes of a third-floor office in the federal courthouse. Inside, Janelle Brooks sat in front of a mirror mounted on an old filing cabinet, light from the window reflecting off patches of uneven skin on her scalp, where strands of her silver hair had been stripped away. There was no blood, no bruises, only silence, the kind that makes no sound, yet aches like thunder. It wasn't the mark of an assault. It was the scar of having one's image, identity, and bodily autonomy taken away. A soft knock broke the silence. The door opened, and it was none other than Janelle Brooks, Janelle's younger sister. No words, no dramatic expression. She walked in, pulled over a folding chair from the wall, opened a small bag, and took out a brand new electric clipper, still carefully wrapped. She plugged it into the wall. No questions, no explanations. Then, looking at her sister in the mirror, her gaze calm. Ready? Janelle didn't answer right away. She stared at her reflection. The woman with steady eyes, lips pressed not in tension, but in resolve. A face once targeted for humiliation, now a living proof of unshakable conviction. Yeah, she said softly. Let's finish it. Each pass of the clipper was slow, deliberate, not like that day when it was used as a weapon. Today it was an instrument of restoration. Every strand that fell wasn't a loss. It was a choice. When Nain turned off the clipper and handed her the mirror, Janelle saw a bald woman, but not an empty one. Her face was clearer than ever, no longer masked by appearance or confined by expectations. Nain placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. You could rock that every damn day and still own every room you walk into. Janelle didn't say anything, but in her eyes was a quiet spark, not from artificial light, but from something rekindled deep within. That night, when Janelle stepped out of the courthouse, no headscarf, no hat, no disguise, just herself. There were a few people standing by the sidewalk. No reporters, no cameras, just regular citizens. An elderly brown-skinned woman with silver hair and thick glasses approached and gently touched Janelle's hand. I didn't think I'd live long enough to see someone like you do what you just did, she whispered. Janelle gave her hand a soft squeeze. You didn't just survive, you cleared the path. Nearby, a teenage boy with a shaved head and a hoodie slowly pulled down his hood. On his scalp were patches of uneven hair, the visible aftermath of chemotherapy. No words, just a knowing look. He nodded, and Janelle nodded back. Between them, a silent pact, that no matter who shaved your head, through violence or medicine, you alone decide what it means. That night she went home. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't check her phone, didn't read emails, though hundreds were flooding in with subject lines in all caps. National spotlight. White House reaches out. NBC interview request. She simply sat on the balcony, looking out at her quiet neighborhood, where the street lamps glowed dimly and crickets hummed beneath the bougainvillea. The breeze touched her scalp, cool and real, unlike the artificial chill of that screening room. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she breathed, not as someone bracing against the world, but simply as herself. The next morning, she returned to court as usual, but everything had changed. As she stepped into the judge's elevator, the stern old janitor looked up, tapped his fist lightly to his chest, then bowed his head. A young officer at the metal detector gave her a quick thumbs up before glancing away. When she entered the courtroom for a minor civil dispute, the entire room stood, before the clerk had even said, "All rise." It had never happened before, but no one was surprised, and she knew. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. For the first time, no robe, No announcement. Just her. She sat. No need to adjust her posture. No need to straighten her desk. Everything was in place. And this time, when she struck the gavel, she wasn't just opening a session. She was establishing a new order, where justice didn't have to be dressed up to matter, didn't have to be beautiful to be believed, didn't have to be soft to be heard. Justice finally could be a bald woman and still be the one holding the gavel. Just 1 week after the sentencing of Deputy Briggs, the halls of Congress received a new dossier titled the Horizon Act. But this time, it didn't come from a lobbying group or a task force committee. It was submitted by a sitting federal judge, someone who had walked the very marble floors where justice had once been betrayed, and who turned that betrayal into the first step toward reform. The senators couldn't ignore it. The media couldn't look away. Over 40 news outlets, from the New York Times and the Atlantic to Vice News, ran the same headline. She didn't just sentence a man, she indicted a system. Not long after, a formal announcement came from the White House. Janelle Brooks had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice, the nation's highest honor awarded to individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to fairness, legal reform, and public ethics. She received the news on a seemingly ordinary morning via email from a senior official who called her the iron gavel behind the softest voice. She didn't respond immediately. She knew that if this was a reward, it wasn't hers alone. She would accept it for those who never had the chance to stand at the witness stand. The award ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., in a grand hall with blue carpeting and front row seats filled with dignitaries, heads of state, and the national press. But when Janelle stepped up to the podium, she didn't face them. Her eyes found the front left row, where Nayan, Megan, once a high school intern, now a first-year law student, and Reverend Curtis Dean, who had handed her the list of the forgotten, sat watching as if they were standing up there with her. She didn't bring a script, no papers. She simply spoke. "I'm not standing here because I'm special. I'm standing here because I was lucky to survive a moment that could have buried me, and because I know too many others who weren't as lucky. I used to think justice came from verdicts. Today I understand. Justice begins the moment we break the silence others built around us." The hall went still, not because people didn't know what she meant, but because, for the first time, someone dared to say it here. She raised the medal, not in pride, but like holding up a mirror for others to see themselves. "This medal doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every person who was forced into silence, who was dismissed, who was made to believe they had no worth, just because they didn't have the right gender, the right skin, the right status. Today, I accept this for them, and for them, I promise I will not stay silent." The ceremony ended with a round of applause. Not loud, not rushed, but deep and slow. The kind of applause not meant for a person, but for something greater, a moment when courage became policy. At the same time, in a modest hearing room on Capitol Hill, the Senate Judiciary Committee formally announced it would open public hearings on the Horizon Act. During the session, when Janelle Brooks' name was mentioned, a senator from Illinois stated, "This isn't just a law proposal, it's a moral reckoning." Within hours, hashtags began trending across social media. #, Horizon Act now, #, protect the bench, #, justice can be human. In cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and Oakland, law student groups began organizing public readings of the proposal, clause by clause, as if it were the manifesto of a new generation. No official campaign had launched, but everyone understood the era of vague promises was over. Janelle didn't attend that hearing. She was in a small classroom, invited by a local high school teacher, where students were learning about constitutional rights and community justice. She didn't give a speech. She just answered questions. One boy asked, "Were you scared when it all started?" She replied, "Yes, so scared I couldn't sleep. But what scared me more was the idea that if I didn't do anything, someone else would have to suffer like I did, and I could never forgive myself for that." At the end of the session, she walked out onto the schoolyard and saw a group of students sitting in a circle, passionately discussing her talk. A small girl, maybe 13, ran up to her and handed her a handwritten note. "I don't know anything about law," the girl said, But if someday I'm humiliated like you were, I want to know someone like you will be there. Janelle took the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. She said nothing. She didn't need to, because she knew every great reform begins the same way, with someone brave enough to face their pain and say, I will not let this happen again. That morning, the sky over Savannah was strangely clear. The air still carried the faint dampness of night mist, but the sun was already high, bright, golden, but gentle. In courtroom 3, chairs were being arranged for the first trial following the midterm recess. It was a simple civil case. No media, no live stream, no protests outside. But the court clerk felt something different in the air, as if even the walls themselves were waiting for someone to return. The side door opened. Janelle Brooks stepped in, not fast, not slow. No one announced her, but everyone stood, not for the title, but for what she now represented. She gave a soft nod and took her seat, bowed her head and reviewed the case file. A contract dispute. The plaintiff, an elderly woman living alone, denied insurance coverage for her late husband's hospital bills due to a clerical error. Janelle showed no reaction, only said, let's begin. No cameras, no grand speeches, but each question she asked, each quiet nod, each small ruling she made carried a silent message. Justice isn't about spectacle, it's about constancy, and it must never be forgotten. Out in the hallway, a young logistics staffer paused and gently repositioned the water box in the waiting room with more care than usual. He had seen everything through the internal security feed. But now, watching Janelle walk that hallway again, head held high, shoulders unburdened by the past, he realized there is nothing more powerful than someone who's been humiliated and still chooses to return. Not for revenge, but to do what's right. That afternoon, the federal judges of Savannah convened a private meeting. In the official minutes, the Horizon Act was adopted in full, no longer a proposal, but a binding ethical code. 6 other courts in the region reached out, seeking to replicate the model. A local news station ran the headline, Savannah quietly rewrites justice, one courtroom at a time. Janelle wasn't at the signing ceremony. She was in a small public library on the west side of the city, reading to a group of 6th graders about law, fairness, and the story of a woman who stood up. Not when chosen, but when no one else dared. She didn't speak about herself, but the way those children looked at her, it was clear. They knew. She was living proof that the system could change if someone had the courage to begin. That evening, she returned home, placing her judge's robe on its wooden hanger, just like any other day. But this time, she looked at it a little longer, not to admire it, but to remember that once that robe couldn't protect her from a pair of clippers. And she knew. Authority does not reside in cloth. It resides in the one who dares to wear it when the world turns away. On her desk sat a new letter from Congress, notification that the Horizon Act had been forwarded to the National Judiciary Committee, with a federal-level presentation scheduled for the fall session. Not a victory, but a door, finally opened by truth. That night, as the city drifted into silence, Janelle stood on her porch, gazing at the sky. No sirens, no urgent calls, just the soft hum of crickets and a dark sky filled with stars. A single shooting star streaked past, brief, beautiful, gone. But she didn't make a wish, because she knew some things don't need wishing, they just need choosing. Someday, when people rewrite the story of justice in America, they may mention her name. But she didn't need that. All she needed was to know that, in a quiet moment between court sessions, a woman might enter a courtroom, bald-headed, and no one would dare laugh. What happened in that trial wasn't just a civil rights violation. It was an indictment delivered straight to the heart of America's justice system. When silence becomes policy, that policy becomes violence. And Janelle Brooks, the woman once treated like a suspect in the very building where she served, did not respond with revenge. She answered with legislation, with patience, and with a truth that no one could distort. Justice is not the robe. It's what you carry, even when they strip you bare. Because of her, a young black boy will grow up unafraid to walk into a courthouse. A young girl will dare to shave her head after chemo without shame. And a woman anywhere will remember, even if they take your hair, they can never take your worth. But this is just the beginning. Because silence doesn't only live in Savannah, it lives in hospitals and classrooms. In every moment we look away when someone is humiliated. So the question is, will you be a witness or the one who begins? If this story moved you, if it made you angry, made you hopeful, made you believe that justice isn't some distant dream, click like, subscribe, share this video with someone you care about, because sometimes all it takes is the right story to change a generation.